Assalamu alaikum. Statistics is perhaps the most maligned of all sciences. It is said about statistics that you can prove almost anything with statistics. It is also said about statistics that there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics, implying that statistics is perhaps even worse than lies and damned lies. This last quote is perhaps the most famous quote about statistics, and this is attributed to Mark Twain. So what is it about statistics that makes it so notorious and open to criticism? We would be seeing in today's session that this criticism is actually mostly unjustified, because the problem does not lie with the science of statistics. Indeed, statistics is the very mode of the method through which we can reason in the face of uncertainty. Most of it is because the human population is very uncomfortable when it deals with numbers and when it deals with uncertainty in general. And to deflect our own shortcoming, we usually put the blame on statistics. Having said that, it is indeed true that many people can maliciously use statistics to mislead, distort, and lie. So in this session, we're going to talk about two things. Firstly, how statistics can be abused, and secondly, when given a statistic, how can we actually ascertain its validity, and what are the questions we must ask ourselves. But we start with the topic of how statistics can be used to mislead and lie. So the first thing we're going to cover in this topic is the aspect of innumeracy. Innumeracy is the inability of humans to deal with numbers or to trust numbers blindly. It is often the case when something is said to us in a qualitative fashion, we are not very sure about this. But if the same information is given to us in a quantitative fashion, qualified with some number, even if that number is spurious, totally made up, we tend to believe that. So this is because of our Platonic belief in numbers, even if the number is coming from nowhere. So we're going to talk of cases of innumeracy and the problems which arise from it. So innumeracy is the mathematic illiteracy that people have, which fails them when they reason about numbers. So to talk about this, let me give you an example. According to a poll, let's say 20% of the female population is going to vote for candidate A, and 30% of the male population is going to vote for candidate A. It is then implied that 50% of the entire population is going to vote for candidate A. So this is the case in which we are misconstruing percentages, because percentages are ratios in which the denominator or the base is commonly set to 100, but that 100 thing is representing a certain population. In this case, the 20% of the people of the female population that is supporting candidate A is different from the other population, and we cannot simply add them up. So this is an example of innumeracy, and this may be used in marketing. So someone who is marketing candidate A may use such a technique, but if we believe in that, it is our own folly, because we do not, it appears that we do not know how ratios and percentages are added. In such a case, if both the populations are equal, in fact, you would have 25% of the entire population which is going to vote for candidate A. And when the populations are dissimilar, we cannot simply add up or take the average of these two. We would have to take into account the actual population. This is because we cannot take the mean of ratios in the same way we take means of numbers to produce the average. So another example is taken from the famous book on innumeracy by John Allen Paulus, who says that he one day was watching television and the newscaster said that on this weekend the chances of rain on Saturday is 50% and the chances of rain on Sunday is 50%. So because of that, there is 100% chance of rain on the weekend. This is again an example of innumeracy, the inability of people to deal with numbers. In this case, this is stemming from a misunderstanding of probability, because probability is a number from 0 to 1. It can be also expressed in terms of percentages. So we cannot simply say that the chances of rain on the weekend is 100%, because to prove this wrong, we only need to produce one counter example. So a counter example in such a case would be the fact that it does not rain at all during the weekend. And if we calculate the probability, that comes to be 0.25, assuming that both these percentages listed earlier of 50% each of probability of rain on Saturday and Sunday, these are independent. So if these are independent, the probability of no rain is 0.25 or 25%. So that proves that there is no 100% chance of rain on the weekend. So this is clearly fallacious reasoning, but this is often done because of our inability to deal with uncertainty. So we've talked of this when we talked of logical fallacies, and we've mentioned the work of Tversky and Kahneman, who have, researched a lot on people's inability to work with probabilities. In the case when the two probabilities are dependent on each other, which is going to be the case, then we would follow the methods of conditional probability to calculate the chances of no rain on the weekend. But in any case, we cannot claim, because of 50% chances of rain on Saturday and Sunday, that it is going to rain for certain on the weekend. Let me give you another example in which percentages can be used to confuse. So imagine that you made an investment in some business and you put 10,000 rupees into a business. And luckily you got a profit of 60% on it. But then after another investment, you suffered a loss of 40%. So you would reason that you had a 60% profit and then a 40% loss. So overall you'd be on the surplus side. But that is wrong, because this is not how percentages work. Because in this case, if you calculate, you'd be even worse off than where you started. Because 60% of the profit is on the initial amount. But 40% of the loss is on the initial amount that is multiplied with the profit. So overall, if we calculate, this would be a factor of 1.6 multiplied by 0.6. So this comes out to be less than 1. So we are doing worse off than being even. So in this case, again, our intuition about probability is failing us. So we need to be very careful when we deal with probability and when we deal with percentages and ratio, that we do not confuse ourselves and we do not suffer from innumeracy and we do not mislead people unintentionally. So every time you have to deal with percentage, remember that percentage has a base. So the context is very important, that what is this thing a percentage of? So is this a percentage of the absolute value, or is this the percentage of the difference in values? We'd be seeing how this can be used often to exaggerate things. When you want to market something, you often exaggerate. And this is an example in which people actively use statistics to lie. So we'd be covering that soon. So now I'm going to talk of another kind of innumeracy. So in this case, this again stems from a misunderstanding of statistical methods. We've talked of regression models, and we've seen that regression models often use a linear, they use a line to represent the relationship between data points. So often a common misunderstanding is that we extrapolate this result to the range of data in which we don't have any measurements. So if you remember when we talked of the don'ts of mathematical modeling, we talked of a man, of an ice skater who is happily skating around on ice in which certain part of it is unbroken. So while he is familiar and he knows that the area around him has frozen ice, he cannot be sure of areas that are far away. In a similar vein, whenever you're doing regression modeling, you have to be very careful that you do not extrapolate your results to a range of values for which the regression does not apply, because it is not certain that regression model is going to remain linear, or the actual model or the trend is going to remain linear. So an example of an error in this regard is this article published in Nature, which is one of the topmost journals, in which they have stated that the Olympics of 2156 is going to be special because the running times of women and men are going to be the same. And they have made this prediction from observing a trend. And you can see the trend on the slide now. And that is the times of running have gradually reduced, or they have improved over time. And the improvement in women's running time is more than the improvement in men's running time. And they have predicted by extrapolating this linear trend that if this linear trend continues till 2156, they would actually have an intersecting point in which both of them would actually be equal. But this is again fallacious, because if you extend this line further on, you would see the absurdity of such a claim. And that would be that if you continue this trend, you would see that beyond a certain time, in fact, the line would actually even cross time is equal to 0. So you would be running a mile even before you actually started running, which is clearly absurd, but that is the logical consequence of the extrapolation made here. So we have to be very careful when we are making extrapolation of linear models to areas where we don't have any data values. Another case in which we can suffer from innumeracy is when we confuse cause with chance and coincidences. So when we talked of hypothesis testing, actually our aim was to differentiate real causes from simply chance playing its part. So to illustrate this aspect of the innumeracy of not being able to deal with chances and not being able to differentiate chance occurrences from real causal occurrences, I'll like to highlight one fact. And that fact is that if you do something often enough, you're going to have rare events happening. And then because we see certain rare events, we then work backwards from there and try to think of possible causes. But this is just simply chance at work. So to illustrate this, imagine that you open up a new office as the stock market predictor, and I'm going to show you how to actually make correct predictions and make correct predictions, consecutive correct predictions only due to chance only. So there is no real skill here. So this is a foolproof method of actually making consecutive correct predictions. So you open up a stock market prediction company and you get a nice stationery pad with a nice logo, and what you are going to do is you're going to send out letters of predictions to potential clients. So imagine that you start with sending 1024 such letters, and for half of them you would predict that a particular stock, let's say you're focusing on one company, for 512 of those you would be saying that this stock is going to increase, and for the remaining 512 you're going to predict that the price of the stock is going to decrease for that particular company. So you're going to be right either way. If the stock market actually forces the price to go up or to go down, you're going to win both ways. A nice little trick that you can do is that for those 512 people to whom you send these letters for which the prediction does not work, you just forget about them and continue sending letters to the people for whom the prediction was right. So for those 512 people, now you can make fresh predictions. So next week you can predict for 256 of those people that the stock market is going to move in a positive direction for that particular company. And for the other 256, you can make the other prediction. So I hope you get the drift of what I'm saying. And then you can extend this all the way from, dividing these 512 people to actually, you keep on going. And then as you see in the slide now, for 256 people, you predict upwards trend, 256 downwards. So either one of them is going to be correct, can be correct, so only one of them would be correct. So then you take up that particular set of people and then you send another 128 sets of letters in which you're going to predict upwards trend for half and downwards trend for half. If you keep on doing this, you will see that in the end, you would have a person for whom you have made 10 consecutive correct predictions. And this is simply because you're making lots of predictions. So if you make lots of prediction, just because of chance, you're going to come up with an occurrence which is going to be very rare. And then once you have made 10 correct predictions to just one person, obviously you sent a lot of predictions, but for one person, you have made 10 consecutive right predictions. Then you can actually talk to that person and say that, you can see how good I am. So maybe you want to, give over all your money to me so that I can invest and so on. So this is a way in which someone who is malicious can exploit the misunderstanding people have. When they see something rare happening, they, automatically think that something, very strange has happened. But rare events happen all the time because so many events are taking place. So while the probability of you winning a lottery is very less, but people win lottery every day. Almost people are winning lottery because many people are playing lottery. So if you have lots of events, rare events would by definition happen. Something related to this is the fact that we've already seen that we actually set an arbitrary standard for our hypothesis testing. We said that we would accept something as strange, or we would reject the null hypothesis if the null hypothesis being true produces results like the one we have only in 5% of the case. But if you imagine doing the experiment 100 times, you would realize that 5 times out of 100 you would come up with a result only due to chance, which is going to be contradictory in a way that only chance is at play, but often you attribute that to particular causes. So we have to be very careful, especially when we have rare events. So we have to rationalize this. So we have to see if really something that we are observing, it's really due to a cause, or is it just chance at play? And for this, actually statistics is a friend for us. It's not a foe. But it is the misunderstanding that people have which is the real problem here. Another problem through which people both mislead and are misled is the presence of bias, which means that a person is already prejudiced, that he already has an agenda. And then once a person has an agenda, he would always look for proofs and for evidence that goes with his agenda. So we have to be very careful about the presence of bias. And we've talked of bias before as well. So if you recall, we've talked of sampling bias. And so for sampling bias, we've seen that if you have a sample which is not representative of the population at large, what you can have is you can have results that are not actually indicative of the real trends. So if you trust those results, you're going to mislead people, or you're going to mislead your own self. So how malicious people can use poor samples is that they can make very broad claims on the basis of very small samples. So this would be a fallacy of hasty generalization that we have already covered. So I'll give you an example of what is termed as proofiness. So this is a new word, and this is very similar to truthiness. Truthiness is the truth at which a person arrives only through his gut instinct. So he knows already without any evidence that this thing is true, and then he searches for proof which will actually support this notion that he has of the truth. So actually the way usually people come at the truth is to actually ascertain the evidence for a certain claim and then see if the evidence actually backs certain hypothesis and then decide if it is actually true or not. But this is, something, this principle working, in inverse. You already know what the truth is, and then you are looking for, evidence which can actually support your argument. And this is very common in politics and similarly in marketing. When you have an agenda already before even making an experiment or before even looking for evidence, you already want to show that your party is better. You already want to show that your system is better. So in that case, what we will be having is not science. So it would be, some playing around with statistics to actually just prove your point. So as an example of a political statistic, this is a quote by Churchill, who said that to a new person joining his office, that the first lesson that you must learn is that when I call for statistics about the rate of infant mortality, what I want is proof that fewer babies died when I was Prime Minister than when anyone else was Prime Minister. This is a political statistic. Unfortunately, you have similar statistics for marketing, and they are also used for advertisements. And so because this is used in marketing, you can also use them for selling network systems. And because of that, we need to be very careful when given a statistic. At the end of this session, I'm going to talk about questions which you must ask yourself before accepting a statistic, because it may be that you're being sold a dummy. So we have to be very careful. It is said that statistics is like a lamppost. So a lamppost may be used by someone who is very weak for support. It can also be used by someone for illumination. So statistics is like that. You can use that for learning about data, for making informed decisions, and you can actually also use it for support. When you already have an agenda and you are biased towards a goal, you can use statistics to prove your point in a misleading way. Another bias which we must know about is what is known as the bias of the scientific journals. Scientific journals like to publish positive results. So if you conduct a study and you have a positive result, but in science, both the positive results and the negative results are equally important. So if you've tried certain technique and it does not work, letting the general public know about this is equally important. But the journals have a bias towards interestingness. So because of that, when this is not reported that a certain line of action was studied and it was found not useful, when this is not published, people are going to do the same thing again and again. So because of this, a lot of time is wasted. This bias is also obvious in all of the media. So if you look up a newspaper, you would imagine that you are living in a very crime-ridden society. So we live in a crime-ridden society, but even for societies in which crime is very less, the newspapers are always filled with reports of crimes because these news are more interesting. So because of that, the people who are reading the newspapers would falsely imagine that they are living in a society which has a lot of crime. So this is another bias. Another bias is known as experimenter's bias. So when you have a hypothesis, you unconsciously start interpreting the data that you have in the light of the hypothesis that you have. So this can actually lead people to fudging their result, which mean accepting those results which are in sync with their hypothesis very quickly, but being a little reluctant in accepting those data which is in a way in conflict with their hypothesis. And this thing is because an inherent part of our psychology. It has been observed that even very great scientists have actually performed this, that it is human nature that you look more closely at data that is in sync with your hypothesis. So this is a cognitive bias which is actually going to impact the conclusions that you're drawing. So the conclusions you'd be drawing would not be 100% correct then. So in a sense, they would be then misleading. So we have to be very careful about all these biases. Also, if we have a bias, we tend to cherry pick results. Cherry picking का मतलब है कि जो favorable evidence है उसको हम present करके सामने रख दें और वो evidence जो आपके favor में नहीं जा रहा उसको छुपा दें. So this is obviously, as highlighted in earlier sessions, is not a good scientific practice, because your work is going to be looked at by many scientists and they are going to discover all these weaknesses. So the best thing is for you to state these weaknesses first up. Do not cherry pick your results and give all evidence for your theory and against your theory. If your hypothesis is really good, you would discover that most of the evidence is for your theory. And if most of the evidence is against your theory, then it is perhaps time for you to revisit your hypothesis and think of a better theory. But because of being biased or being married to a hypothesis or because of proofiness, जब आप बहुत ज़्यादा linked होते हैं एक hypothesis से, तो एक तरह से आप blind हो जाते हैं to all those evidence which is not supporting your hypothesis. So this would be a kind of lying with statistics, which we should be very careful when we are doing our own experiments. And when we are studying the experiments, results shown by other people, we should have this in mind, that this is possibly one reason why we have such results. Another case in which we may be biased and we may use proofiness to actually exaggerate is by using percentages. So we have seen the usage of percentages before, but then we were talking of innumeracy, which dealt with the people's inability to deal with numbers. And because they do not know how percentages work, they were making honest errors. But now we are going to talk about people who are biased. So as a proofiness technique, they're going to use percentages to bolster their argument or to exaggerate, certain claim. So as an example of that, imagine that you are measuring a certain network and you get a reading first of 1 kilobits per second. And then once you measure the network again, it comes out to be 11 kilobits per second. So if your argument is that the network performance has improved a lot, what you can say is the difference is 10, and 10 is 1,000% of the initial value, which was 1 kilobit per second. So because of that, since you have increased by 10 kilobits per second, instead of stating that you have increased by 10 kilobits per second, which does not look very impressive, what you can state is that you have had 1,000% increase in throughput, which looks a lot more impressive. So another way in which percentages may be used is when you want to hide, the embarrassingly small samples that you've used. It is obvious that, if you are extrapolating or generalizing from very small samples, clearly everyone would be able to make out that your evidence is flimsy. But if you hide this fact by presenting percentages, then it starts looking impressive. Imagine that you want to convey that 6 out of 7 people that you surveyed actually prefer your system. But if you state it like this, the consumer of this argument is going to easily find that your study is very limited because you have only checked with 7 people or with 7 firms or with 7 companies, and that by itself is not a large enough sample. But what you can do is you can state that 83.3% people prefer our system to our competition, and you can generalize this to other scenarios in which the small sample is hidden away by the fact that you are using percentages, and the base of this percentage is unknown, and because of this an unwary person would think that this is a very impressive percentage, because he may think that you've had this statistic calculated from a very large sample. Another case is when you confound the base of your percentage to be the final value rather than the initial value. क्योंकि जब हम percentages लेते हैं उसकी base हम आमतौर पे initial value लेते हैं. तो a claim that we have reduced the prices 400% is absurd, because that would mean that instead of taking payments, they're actually giving away payments. But in this case, the error is that instead of normalizing or taking the base to be the initial value, they're taking the base to be the final value. So as an example, if you're selling an item at 5,000 rupees, your initial price is 5,000. And let's say you reduce the price to 1,000. So the difference is 4,000. But when you want to present this as a percentage, it should be normalized with the initial price. Then you can state that you've had an 80% price reduction. What you cannot do is, you should not actually compare the difference and keeping the base as the final price, because that is going to give a very exaggerated value. And this is the reason we have the statement that there has been a 400% reduction, and this is playing on the fact and exploiting the fact that many people do not really understand percentages, and also you're not sharing the base of your comparison. So in this way, this is a conscious way of exploiting statistics to mislead and distort real data. Another case in which we can use statistics to mislead is by using incorrect statistical measures. So as an example, if you use a mean where median would be more appropriate, or in cases where mode is more appropriate, you use mean. So we've actually, when we covered in our session on summarizing data, we've covered the aspects of arithmetic mean, the median, and the mode. As an example, this is an example from Darrell Huff's book on how to lie with statistics, which is the best-selling book about statistics, which explains the kind of thought people associate with statistics. So in this example, this is a population in which most of the people are actually having a salary of 2,000. So this is in dollars. The median is the measure which actually divides the population in half. Half the people are earning more than this, and half the people are earning less. And the arithmetic average or the arithmetic mean is actually the average taken, the typical value that we associate with an average, the sum over the total number of people in the population. So we can actually present different statistical measures of the central value to bolster whatever claim that we want to make. So if we want to make a claim that this population is very well off, we would use the arithmetic average, because that is a measure which suits our purpose. And if we want to show that the average person is doing very poorly, we can make use of mode as the statistic that we'd be using. But what is more important when we want to present data ethically is to see what people actually expect, because you should be presenting data in a way which people expect. And if you do not do so, you would actually be misleading people, because they would be imagining the average to be of some other kind, and the data that you are giving them is of some other kind, and that would lead to a confusion which can mislead people. So we've talked of the differences between different kinds of averages, and in our earlier session, we've talked of the limitations of arithmetic mean. So just as a brief summary, we talked of arithmetic mean being inappropriate when you have a multimodal distribution. So the example of a farm with horses and chickens, and you have the statement that the average legs on an animal in this farm is 3, which is absurd. Also, arithmetic mean is not appropriate when you have high variability. The example of a man with his head in refrigerator and his feet in boiling water. We will not be, right in saying that this man is feeling okay on average. Similarly, we should not do that for data. Also, we said arithmetic mean is influenced by outliers. The example of a billionaire going to a village full of very poor people. And we talked of the usage of arithmetic mean for categorical data. The example of the family with 2.5 children. So we must remember these limitations and only apply arithmetic mean where it's appropriate. Another error that we can make is to confuse the average value for all of the values. Average value does not mean all of the values are like the average value and there is no variation around this. So a typical joke to illustrate this is that to think of a statistician who drowned in a river whose average depth was only 3 feet. This was because if we imagine that the river is homogeneous and it has 3 feet of depth all over the place, this is clearly fallacious because the river is going to have a lot of variation. As another example, there is a book named The Flaw of Averages, in which this point is made that many people misunderstand averages and they disregard variation. So to illustrate this, have a look at the cartoon on the screen. You would see a drunk man who is wandering around on a road and he is moving around the central line in an erratic way and cars are passing him around. So if you calculate the path he has traced out, you would see that he is taking an erratic route through the middle of the road, but it's never on the center of the road. But if you take the average of this, it would be the exact center of the road. In this dramatic case, this is the difference between life and death. Because if we calculate the state of this drunk man on the average position, which is the central line, he's going to be alive. But his average state is going to be dead because he would almost never be on the center line. So this is again highlighting the fact that average is just a measure. It does not mean the entire data is like that. Let's now move on to talk of a very important topic, which is the usage of improper graphics to mislead people. And this is perhaps the most common way of misleading people. So the first example I'm going to give you is the graph which is given the name of a G-Wiz graph. So I've talked of the book How to Lie with Statistics written by Darrell Huff, and he has given a graph that has omitted the origin line, the name of a G-Wiz graph, because it makes even small differences large. As an example, so imagine the graph on the left hand side, you would see that there is some difference as we move around the entire year, but because we have 0 as the origin, you would see that the differences in amounts are not unduly exaggerated. But what if you are interested in exaggerating this difference? What you can do is you can omit the origin and you can start from a much higher value. So most of your graph then would be focusing on only some part of the overall values of the chart, and you would have something shown on the right hand side of the slide now. And if you want to exaggerate further, you can look at the figure on the bottom right side of this slide. So now we are plotting the data from the values of $20 billion till $22 billion. So because of that, because the entire y-axis is just, these values, the range between these values, you would see that the graph is a very impressive increase. So if your aim in creating this graph was to show a very impressive increase, what you can do is that you can actually omit the 0 and use such a technique. But if we are ethical about this and we want to present data in an ethical manner which is consistent with the real data, it is always advised that you actually start the y-axis from the value of 0, especially when we are plotting quantitative data, because then the length of the line actually is signifying something. It is signifying the value, the absolute value. So it is very important, and in most cases you should include the origin. In some cases where it's appropriate that you want to highlight certain patterns that would not be visible if you make an entire graph, you should first of all state that you are omitting 0, and then you can use this graph. But the important thing is that you should not mislead the audience, and for that you need to inform the audience and only use this kind of a graph with a lot of caution. Okay, another tool that has been invented to deceive, mislead and lie about data is the usage of double y-axis. So in a typical line graph, you have an x-axis, a horizontal axis and the vertical axis, and the difference in values are traced out typically in the y-axis. So the graph which is shown now, which is taken from the book of Howard Weiner, again a very prominent expert in data visualization, he has shown the graph in which the death rates are plotted for both smokers and non-smokers. As we can see from this graph, that the difference is very large. For all ages, the people who smoke have a higher death rate. But what if you have a vested interest? Imagine that you are in the statistics department of a major tobacco company and you want to somehow reverse this result or reverse the actual facts. What you can do is you can invent another y-axis on the right hand side and write another scale on that. So this is actually seen on the graph on the right hand side of the slide now. On the left hand side you have a different scale, and on the right hand side you have a different scale, and now you can see both the lines are very close together. This is clearly misleading because the actual data is showing a different trend. So we must always be very careful when using double y-axis. Sometimes this is used for brevity, क्योंकि आम तौर पे journals में let's say आपने publish करना है, they have constraints of space. But whatever the case is, you must always, first of all explore some other ideas of, graphing your data, and only use this as a last resort. And even if you are using this, you must ensure that you are not misleading by choosing, arbitrary scales. Okay, another case in which you can use graphs to mislead is by omitting, scales. If you omit what scales you're using or what units you're using for measuring data, then the graph becomes meaningless, and it can be, manipulated in any way you want. So as an example, this is a graph which was published in a magazine about increasing cost of tuition fee and decreasing ranking of a university. So it is clear that you cannot compare the ranking of a university with the tuition fee, because tuition fee is measured in currency, whereas ranking is not measured in currency. So it's a comparison of apples and oranges. To actually hide this fact, what the creators of this chart have done is that they have omitted any label on the y-axis. So then this is actually completely arbitrary. You can make any statement you want. आप ऊपर वाली line को नीचे कर दें, or you can play around with the chart, because there is no, first of all, there is no scale of measurement on the y-axis, and even the lines that have been drawn, they cannot be compared because they are measured on different scales. So every time you see a graph in which the axis is missing a label or the measurement of scale is not mentioned, you should always be very wary of this graph. And almost always you should reject this graph for making any decisions about data. And it is not only, common magazines which are using these techniques. In fact, many politicians use this technique, and this is an example of a former US president who is showing a graph in which he's, claiming that his budget, while it is going to tax more in the, near future, it is going to give a lot of savings in the long run. But in this graph, what is on the y-axis? Is there some scale of measurement? There is no scale of measurement. There's just this dollar sign, which does not mean anything. At least it means that you have money on the y-axis, but what are you measuring in? You're measuring in tens or hundreds or thousands, millions, billions, trillions. It does not say. So we cannot really make any conclusion from this. And such a graph is a clear sign that you have a con artist at work. You have malicious play, or someone is, exploiting you by presenting a graph which is not really consistent with data. Okay, so another way in which you can mislead is by messing with the amount of size of your bins in a histogram. So if you see the slide now, you have 3 graphs shown which look very different. But the fact of the matter is that they are showing the very same data. So why this huge discrepancy in the graphs when we are actually graphing the same data? The fact is that the person creating this graph is actually messing with the size of the bin. So if you see the top graph, जो आप बार देख रहे हैं, it is actually the same amount is represented in 2 bins in the second graph, and it is represented in a lot of bins in the last graph. So by appropriate choosing of the bins, you can actually tailor the graph to any message that you want to convey. So in this sense, a graph can lie, but the problem here is that an unwary person would be gullible and would not see the labels. So a person who's making this graph can claim that, I'm not lying. The actual facts are on the graph. But just because the actual facts are on the graph does not mean that this is not lying, because you're using 2 medium here. One is the textual medium and the other one is the visual medium. So while you have the textual medium conveying the data accurately, the visual medium is lying. And because the visual medium is the dominant medium, it overwhelms the textual medium. So we would be fair to say that this person who has created this graph is lying. And for us, we should be very careful when drawing histograms, and we should present in a way which people expect from us, because the way a graph works is to communicate data. So to communicate something, you have to present in a way which people expect. Okay, another kind of a G-Wiz graph is in which you actually take out a certain portion of the graph. So if you see the slide now, you would see a bar graph in which the placeholder of 0 is shown, but the bulk of the graph is actually taken off. So you have a scale break, and after 0 you have the next reading is a very high value. So where is the remaining graph? The purpose of this graph again can be construed as the act of lying, because the differences between the values that are shown is not great, but the graph is giving the impression that we have a big difference. So we can call this as an ad hoc G-Wiz graph, and it has the same problems. So if for any case you need to have a scale break, you should make it very prominent. And another thing that you can try instead of doing a scale break is to transform your data by taking a logarithm. And because when you take a logarithm, its resolution improves, and you can present a similar data in a more meaningful way. Another case in which we can lie about data is by presenting one-dimensional data as a 2-dimensional picture. So imagine we're interested in comparing how much two carpenters earn. So one carpenter is earning 5,000 rupees, the other one is earning 10,000 rupees per month. So we can actually represent the amount of 5,000 by some money box. Okay, and the other person, the person earning 10,000 would have two money boxes or two money bags. But what we can do is also, if to exaggerate the difference, हम जो एक मनी बैग है दूसरे मनी बैग की हाइट उसकी डबल कर दें. But the case is that when you are doubling the height, the area is actually increasing 4 times because the area is 2-dimensional. आपने जब height increase की है, the width also increases. So it is always improper, almost always, especially in scientific communication, to present one-dimensional data as a two-dimensional area, representing it by a picture. So let's see some more graphs that are lying because of this. They are presenting one-dimensional data as a two-dimensional picture. So if you observe these graphs, you would observe that the difference between numbers is not that great. लेकिन चूंकि हम स्केलिंग कर रहे हैं हाइट के हिसाब से, तो ये disproportionate scaling है. So if you see the shrinking family doctor, the shrink is actually not that high as shown by the visual picture. So in this case, this graph is lying, and for more you should refer to the book of Edward Tufte, in which he defines the lie factor, in which he says that he is taking a ratio of the effect that is shown in the graphic divided by the real effect. And if that value is very high, then your graph is lying, and you should be very wary of that. Another case in which we lie is by using pie charts, and especially if we are using 3-dimensional pie charts. And this is again done by very famous people. As you can see, a famous news channel is showing a very wrong pie chart, because a pie chart, the entire sum has to add up to 100%, but the sum here is a lot more than 100%. If you see the other graph on the right hand side, you can actually not differentiate between the green part of the pie and the purple part of the pie, and you would think validly or you would perceive the green part to be more, but that is not the case as presented by the numbers. So again, the 3D charts have a tendency to exaggerate, because जब आपने false perspective डाल दिया है, then you cannot correctly estimate the relative proportions. उसके अलावा भी humans do not perceive the area very well, and as a demo, if you look the circles on the bottom of the slide now, you would see that the smaller circle has an area of 1, let's say, and I ask you to guess what is the area of the larger circle, and I will safely estimate that you would choose a value other than the actual value, because that is done by most people. The actual value is 16, but most people cannot correctly estimate this. Also, many of the default features that the common graphs have actually detract from the message. And we'd be seeing when we talk of visual display of quantitative data that your focus should be, all your design should be focused on bringing out the variation in data. And everything that is extraneous should actually be removed. In both these cases, you have 3D effects, and you have strong backgrounds, you have grid lines. So all these design features are actually overwhelming the real data. So we should be focusing on the data, and all the design has to complement it and not detract from it. Also, you can fill your charts with hatchings, or you can build perspectives. काफी कुछ आप कर सकते हैं ग्राफ से, but usually this is a sign of poor design and a poor data set. If you see the graph on the right hand side, this is called by Edward Tufte as perhaps the worst graphic that is made into print. If you see this graph, this has many flaws. It has 2 scale breaks. If you see the y-axis, दो जगह से स्केल ब्रेक हो रहा है. उसके अलावा there are only 5 data points, so all of this design is actually meaningless, and it would be much more useful to present this in a simple form. You present the 5 data points and that's it. So the design is actually complementary to data. It is never meant to be the dominant portion of a graph. Okay, so let me now talk very briefly about how to talk back to a statistic, and we would be seeing that when presented a statistic, you should always ask yourself that, okay, I'm given this number, but who is saying that this number is true? So you should check the source of the data, who is claiming this statistic to be true, and then you should ask yourself, how does that organization know? What procedures did they adopt? And you should critically analyze the procedures. You should always ask yourself, what is missing in this data? And especially you should analyze the statistic presented to you if this is relevant to the decision that you're trying to make. Because often we've talked of fallacies which actually bring irrelevant arguments. We've talked of the fallacies of red herring and of the fallacy of a straw man. So in both cases you bring arguments which are not really tackling the question that you are asking. And lastly, you must also measure the statistic on common sense. So I'll be wrapping up the lecture now, and I'd be finishing by saying that statistics, while it is a very powerful tool and it lets us reason in the face of uncertainty, it can also be used to lie, mislead, and distort data. We should be learning statistical techniques so we do not unintentionally fall victim to the same crime. And also, when we are sold such erroneous data, we're able to make out that what statistics are correct and what are not. I'll see you next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.